In a quiet kitchen somewhere in America, a woman opens an envelope, slides a cotton swab into a plastic tube, and mails her saliva to a laboratory in another state. 6 weeks later, the result arrives. A thread of ancestry she had never quite believed in, half remembered from a grandmother's story, turns out to be real. She is, in some small measurable percentage, Cherokee. She is not alone. Roughly 25 million Americans today claim Cherokee ancestry. The actual enrolled Cherokee Nation numbers in the hundreds of thousands. How did the blood of one indigenous people come to run through an entire continent? The answer is not a single moment. It is a 1,000-year story of migration, agriculture, written language, forced exile, and quiet survival in the mountains while the world looked away. If you're fascinated by how the deep past still moves through us, hit subscribe. The name Cherokee was never their own. It came from outside, from the mouths of strangers who heard the sound of their language and reached for a word to describe them. Some scholars trace it to a Creek term meaning people of different speech. Others believe it derives from the name of a neighboring tribe, the Shellak, or from one of the 5 Iroquois nations to the north. The truth is that no one knows for certain. The name they answer to today was given to them by people who were not them. The name they used for themselves was Aniyunwiya, the principal people. The distinction matters more than it might first appear. It tells you how the Cherokee saw themselves long before anyone arrived to rename them. Not a marginal people, not a forest tribe, the principal ones, the center of the human world as they understood it. And there is a linguistic puzzle embedded in that self-understanding. The Cherokee language is Iroquoian. It belongs to the same family of languages spoken by the great confederacies of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, hundreds of miles to the north. And yet the Cherokee lived nowhere near those peoples. They lived in the mist-wrapped southern Appalachians, surrounded by speakers of entirely unrelated tongues. How did an Iroquoian language end up in the mountains of what would later be called North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Kentucky, and South Carolina? Anthropologists and historians have argued over the answer for more than a century. One school holds that the Cherokee were relative latecomers to the southern Appalachians, migrating from the Great Lakes region in late prehistoric times and bringing their language with them. Another school proposes a far older origin, somewhere in present-day Texas or northern Mexico, with the Cherokee drifting north and east before finally settling in the mountains. The Cherokee themselves remember a migration. In the late 19th century, an ethnographer named James Mooney lived among the people and recorded the oral traditions still preserved by their elders. The accounts described an ancient journey south from the region of the Great Lakes, a movement of an entire people through forests and river valleys in search of the homeland they would eventually claim. Whether memory or invention or some weave of both, the story matched at least one of the scholarly theories with uncanny precision. What can be said with confidence is that by around 1500 BC, a distinct Cherokee language had emerged. And by around the year 1000 AD, the people speaking it were living a settled, woodland life in the southern Appalachians. They built their villages in the river bottoms. They farmed the floodplains. They absorbed influence from the great Mississippian mound-building cultures to their west, adopting elements of their religion, their politics, and their craft. By the time the first Europeans set foot in the New World, the Cherokee had been a recognizable people in a recognizable homeland for more than 2,000 years. They had a language, a cosmology, a system of government, a network of towns, and a clear sense of who they were and where they belonged. They were the principal people. And the mountains they lived in were not a refuge or a frontier. They were the center of the world. Everything that happened next happened to a nation that already knew exactly who it was. Long before the Cherokee were a name on a treaty or a tribe on a map, they were a people who knew how to grow corn. The economy of the southern Appalachians ran on agriculture, corn, beans, and squash, the great triad of indigenous farming across nearly the entire eastern half of the continent, formed the foundation of the Cherokee diet. Sunflowers were grown for their seeds and their oil. Tobacco was grown for ceremony. The fields were tended primarily by women working the rich bottomland soils along the rivers, and the harvest sustained a population that by the time of European contact numbered in the tens of thousands. Hunting and gathering supplemented but never replaced the fields. Deer, bear, and elk were taken with bows and arrows in the high country. Smaller game such as raccoons, rabbits, squirrels, and turkeys were hunted with a tool almost unique to the southeastern tribes, the long cane blowgun, propelling darts tipped with wood and feather. For fish, the Cherokee used hooks and lines, spears, and woven traps set in the rivers. Wild roots, berries, greens, and nuts filled in the rest. A Cherokee town was a small world unto itself. 30 to 60 homes arranged around a central plaza, with a council house at its heart, large enough to hold the entire community for meetings and ceremonies. Inside the council house, a sacred fire was kept burning year-round. Approximately 200 such towns spread across the southern Appalachians at the height of the culture. The homes themselves were wattle and daub, a circular framework of branches woven together like an upside-down basket, plastered with mud, partially sunk into the ground for warmth. Later generations would shift to bark-roofed log cabins, windowless, with a single door and a smoke hole cut into the roof, and the towns were organized by women. The Cherokee were a matrilineal society. Descent traced through the mother, property passed through the mother. The home belonged to the woman, the land belonged to the woman, the children belonged to the mother's clan. 7 matrilineal clans wove through every town in the nation, and a Cherokee individual knew their clan affiliation before they knew almost anything else about themselves. Women were the heads of households, the farmers of the family's land, and the spiritual mothers of their clans, honored as the givers and nurturers of life through both childbirth and the growing of plants. The government reflected the same fundamental balance. Each town was led by 2 chiefs. A white chief in peacetime who presided over council meetings, mediated disputes, and guided the agricultural calendar. A red chief in wartime who led the warriors and commanded the defense. And at every war council, an assemblage of important women sat as counselors to the male leaders, regulating the treatment of prisoners and weighing in on questions of peace and conflict. No major decision was made without their voices. The ritual year turned on a single great festival. The busk, the green corn ceremony, marked the ripening of the new harvest. Old fires were extinguished. The council house was swept clean. A new sacred fire was kindled by friction, and embers from it were carried to relight every hearth in the town. Debts were forgiven. Quarrels were settled. The year began again. This was the picture the Cherokee had built of themselves by the time the first Europeans stepped onto the soil of their homeland. Complex, agricultural, female-centered, ceremonially rich. Not a stereotype waiting to be imposed. A nation already in motion. The first European to set eyes on a Cherokee was almost certainly a Spaniard, and he was almost certainly looking for gold. In 1540, Hernando de Soto led an expedition through the southeastern interior of the continent, cutting a path of violence and disease across territories that no European had ever entered. Somewhere along the Tennessee River, his column encountered the Cherokee. The meeting was brief. De Soto did not linger in the mountains. He was hunting for cities of silver that did not exist, and the Cherokee, offering no such promise, were spared the worst of what he was capable of. But the diseases his men carried did not need his attention to do their work. The first invisible wave had already begun. For more than a century afterward, the mountains shielded the Cherokee from the slower European tides washing over the coasts. Until 1609 and the founding of Virginia, they remained relatively isolated. The next intruders came not as armies but as merchants. By 1629, English traders had pushed west through the Appalachian foothills and reached Cherokee villages with pack horses loaded for exchange. By the late 17th century, the Cherokee population, depleted by earlier waves of disease, still numbered somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000. In 1673, English settlers arrived at the Cherokee capital of Ekota to formally open trade relations. The goods they brought were transformative: brass kettles, woven textiles, scissors, knives, metal hatchets, hoes, and, most consequential of all, guns and ammunition. In exchange, the Cherokee provided deer skins by the tens of thousands, river cane baskets, beeswax, and captives taken in war. The trade changed everything about how Cherokee society worked. Leadership began to migrate away from the medicine men and toward the warriors, because the warriors were the ones bringing in the hides that bought the guns. Hunting, once a seasonal contribution to a primarily agricultural economy, became a commercial enterprise pursued for profit. The old rhythms of the corn calendar began to bend around the new rhythm of the trading post, and the alliances among neighboring nations, already complicated, became impossible to manage as each tribe scrambled for advantage with the new European powers. By 1680, most of the tribes of the region had acquired their first firearms, and the Cherokee had fortified their larger villages with palisades. Constant fighting broke out with the Catawba to the east. Friction grew with the Creek and Choctaw to the south. The traditional hostility with the Chickasaw to the west sharpened. And further north, the long struggle between the French, the Dutch, and the English for control of the fur trade ignited the Beaver Wars, drawing nations from across the continent into a conflict none of them had begun. In 1730, the Cherokee formally allied themselves with the British Crown. They pledged their loyalty to King George II and promised to trade only with the English, in exchange for protection from the French and a guaranteed supply of European goods. And then the catastrophe arrived that no alliance could fight off. A series of smallpox epidemics tore through the Cherokee population across the 18th century. By the time the worst had passed, roughly half of all Cherokee living were dead. Entire towns were emptied. Entire clans were broken. The nation that had stood for more than 2,000 years in the mountains was, for the first time, fighting for its survival as a people. And it was only the beginning. When the United States declared independence, it inherited the Cherokee problem along with everything else. By that point, 10 treaties between 1721 and 1777 had already stripped enormous sections of land from Cherokee control. The new American government, founded by men who had spent their lives on the colonial frontier, took the inherited situation and built a policy out of it. Henry Knox, the first Secretary of War, and President George Washington himself believed they had found a path to lasting peace. They called it civilization. In their view, Native Americans would become farmers in the European sense. They would give up the vast lands required for a hunting economy. They would settle into permanent villages, wear European clothes, speak English, convert to Christianity, and learn the skills of the new American household. Missionaries arrived in Cherokee towns with reading, writing, arithmetic, housekeeping, personal grooming, and table etiquette. The civilizing program was earnest, well-funded, and from Washington's perspective, generous. The Cherokee response was more sophisticated than any planner in Philadelphia had anticipated. They accepted what they found useful and rejected what they did not. They did not assimilate passively. They adapted strategically. And then they did something that no one had asked them to do, and that no other indigenous people on the continent would accomplish on the same scale. His name was Sequoyah. He was a silversmith. He was not formally literate in any language. He had observed European writing and grasped, in a flash of insight that historians still find astonishing, that the strange marks on paper carried sound. Working alone, sometimes ridiculed by his own people, occasionally accused of witchcraft, he spent 12 years building a complete writing system for the Cherokee language from scratch. 86 characters, each representing a single syllable. It was the only known instance in recorded history of a single individual inventing a writing system for an entire language without prior literacy. The consequence was almost immediate. Within years of Sequoyah's syllabary being adopted by the Cherokee Nation, literacy rates among the people had surpassed those of most of the surrounding American population. Letters flew back and forth between towns. Laws were recorded. Sacred texts were translated. A printing press was acquired, and in 1828, the Cherokee Phoenix was published, the first Native American newspaper, printed in both English and the syllabary that one man had built with his own hands. The Cherokee built a new capital at Aniyunwiya. They drafted a written constitution modeled on the American one. They were doing precisely what Washington and Knox had asked them to do. By every measure the new United States had proposed, they were becoming a civilized nation, and it did not save them. Gold was discovered on Cherokee land in northern Georgia. White settlers poured in illegally. The state of Georgia passed laws extending its jurisdiction over Cherokee territory in open defiance of federal treaties. In May of 1830, Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, demanding the relocation of every eastern tribe to territory west of the Mississippi. 4 of the 5 civilized tribes signed removal treaties. The Cherokee refused. Chief John Ross took the case to the Supreme Court and won. The court ruled that Georgia had no authority over Cherokee territory. Jackson ignored the ruling. A small unauthorized faction signed the Treaty of Aniyunwiya in 1835. The Senate ratified it by a single vote. The Cherokee were given until May of 1838 to leave their homeland forever. The deadline arrived in the spring of 1838, and the soldiers came with it. Federal troops moved through the Cherokee homeland with bayonets fixed, gathering families out of their houses, out of their fields, out of their churches. Roughly 16,000 Cherokee men, women, and children were herded into stockades hastily constructed across the southern Appalachians. Possessions were left behind, crops were left standing, livestock was left to be claimed by the white settlers already pressing in behind the soldiers. In June, the first groups were loaded onto flatboats at Ross's Landing in Georgia and sent down the Tennessee River. The boats were described by witnesses as so crammed with human beings that they sat dangerously low in the water and nearly sank. Some Cherokee traveled by train, most walked. The path stretched roughly 1,000 miles to the west. It began in summer heat and ended in deep winter. The columns moved through Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas before reaching the territory that would later become Oklahoma. Disease moved with them: dysentery, pneumonia, whooping cough, measles. The very young and the very old went first. Then the exhausted, then those who simply gave out on the side of the road. By the time the survivors reached the Western Territory, more than 4,000 Cherokee were dead. The path that took them came to be remembered in their own language as Nuna Daul Tsuni, the trail where they cried. Not everyone left. A small number refused to be moved. They hid in the rugged coves and ridges of the Great Smoky Mountains, surviving on what the forest gave them, waiting out the soldiers. Others had already secured legal title to land under earlier treaties, particularly the Treaty of 1817, and could not be forcibly removed. A white man named William Holland Thomas, raised among the Cherokee and eventually serving as the only white chief in their history, quietly purchased tract after tract of land with Cherokee money, holding it in his own name because Cherokees could not legally hold it in theirs. The land he assembled would become the Qualla boundary, the reservation in western North Carolina where the eastern band of Cherokee Indians remains today. But for those who reached Indian territory, arrival did not bring peace. The Cherokee Nation now consisted of 3 groups who did not trust one another. The old settlers, who had emigrated voluntarily in earlier decades, the Treaty Party, who had signed away the homeland at Aniyunwiya, and the National Party, loyal to Chief John Ross, who had refused removal until the soldiers came. In June of 1839, the reckoning came. On a single morning, in 3 coordinated attacks, members of the National Party assassinated the three men they held most responsible for the Treaty of New Echota. Major Ridge was shot from horseback on a road in Arkansas. His son, John Ridge, was dragged from his bed and stabbed to death in front of his family. Elias Boudinot, the former editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, was lured outside by men claiming to need medicine and killed with knives and tomahawks. What followed was civil war within the Cherokee Nation. Years of violence, ambushes, and retaliations, finally brokered by the United States in a peace treaty signed on August 6, 1846. And then the American Civil War arrived, and the Cherokee fractured again. Thomas's Legion fought for the Confederacy until the very end, surrendering on May 9, 1865, the last Confederate unit to lay down arms in North Carolina. After the Civil War, the federal government turned to the slow work of dismantling what was left. The General Allotment Act of 1887 passed over Cherokee objections, broke up communal tribal land into individual parcels assigned to enrolled members. The surplus, all the land left over once each Cherokee had received an allotment, was sold off to non-native settlers. In 1891, the western expansion of Cherokee territory, known as the Cherokee Outlet, was sold to the United States, and in 1893 it was opened to white settlement in one of the largest land runs in American history. The territorial nation the Cherokee had rebuilt in the West was being unmade as deliberately as the one they had been driven from in the East. In 1907, Oklahoma achieved statehood. With it, the Cherokee government was formally dissolved. Tribal members became United States citizens. They lost the right to elect their own chiefs, who from that point forward would be appointed by the President of the United States. That right would not be returned until Richard Nixon signed it back into law in 1970. And yet, the Cherokee did not disappear. In 1918, on the Western Front of the First World War, the American Expeditionary Forces faced a problem they could not solve with code books. The Germans were intercepting every message. The signal officers attached to the 119th and 120th U.S. Infantry Regiments noticed something about their soldiers from western North Carolina. A number of them were Cherokee. The officers guessed correctly that no German linguist would have the slightest idea what to do with a Cherokee transmission. They put the Cherokee soldiers on the field telephones and told them to speak in their own language. The tactic worked instantly. The Cherokee code talkers became the first known use of Native American languages to transmit messages under fire in American military history. A generation later, during the Second World War, Cherokee soldiers served again as code talkers alongside Navajo, Comanche, and other native speakers across both the Pacific and European theaters. Today, 3 federally recognized Cherokee nations carry the lineage forward. The Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, the United Kituwa Band, also in Oklahoma, and the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina, descended from the families who had hidden in the Smokies and the lands William Holland Thomas had quietly bought in their name. Which brings us back to the number that opened this story. Roughly 25 million Americans today claim some Cherokee ancestry. The enrolled Cherokee population numbers in the hundreds of thousands. The gap between the two figures is more than 50 to 1, and the reasons for it are layered. Centuries of intermarriage on the colonial frontier, particularly with Scots-Irish settlers pushing into the southern mountains, left genuine Cherokee lineage scattered through the Appalachian population. Individuals left the tribal roles to pass into white society, carrying their ancestry into the general population. The families who hid in the Smokies merged quietly with rural neighbors. Cherokee freedmen, descended from people enslaved by Cherokee households, carry the cultural memory, if not always the lineage. And some of the 25 million is family mythology, the so-called Cherokee princess grandmother story that turns out, under DNA testing, to be far more often imagined than real. The genuine inheritance is still vast. The language survives in the speech of 12,000 to 22,000 fluent speakers, The syllabary Sequoyah carved still appears on highway signs across northeastern Oklahoma. Somewhere in America, the woman in the quiet kitchen folds the laboratory results back into their envelope. The thread of ancestry she had half believed in is real. It joins her, faintly and across many generations, to a people who built a written language while most of the world was still illiterate. To a people who drafted a constitution while their land was being auctioned beneath them. To a people who walked 1,000 miles through winter and built a nation again on the other side. To a people who sent their language into 2 world wars as a weapon their enemies could not break. For 200 years, the United States tried to make the Cherokee disappear. They did not disappear. They scattered. And in scattering, they entered the bloodstream of a continent. 25 million Americans carry a piece of that survival. Most of them have no idea what they are carrying.